We have multi-tool interface.
Hi, Relaxed Recaps here. Today I'm going to explain an American biographical film called Pirates of Silicon Valley. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The story begins in 1984 with a monologue by Steve Jobs. He seeks to express his vision of developing an entirely new consciousness, similar to that of an artist or a poet. He claims that what he's doing will rewrite the history of human thought. As the camera moves, it's revealed that Steve is actually speaking to a videographer who is working on an Apple computer advertisement. The director, on the other hand, is more concerned with the technical components of the advertisement than with Steve's speech. Fast forward to 1997, when Steve returns to Apple and announces a new partnership with Microsoft. Then we see Bill Gates, who is currently being projected onto a screen looming over the audience via live broadcast. However, the audience present there repeatedly boos Bill Gates and shouts that Microsoft is going to ruin Apple. To answer the question of what conditions led up to the current event, the film flashes back to Steve Jobs' youth, way before the formation of Apple. The year is 1971 on the campus of the University of California during the student anti-war movement. Steve Jobs and his best friend Steve Wozniak are being apprehended on campus after a riot between students and police. They start running from the chaos, and after finding shelter, Steve proclaims that even though the protesters are on the streets, they're not revolutionaries. Instead, he considers himself and Woz to be actual revolutionaries because they're here to make a difference in the universe. Wozniak recounts how Jobs was always distinct from everyone else. While he only saw kilobytes or circuit boards and everything, Steve saw karma, or the meaning of the universe. A few days later, Woz creates a device called the Blue Box, one of the first phone line crackers that allowed anyone to call any place for free. For the time being, Steve is able to sell some of Woz's inventions for some cash. But one day, after nearly getting caught by the police, Woz decides to develop something that won't land them in jail, which is a computer. Following this, Woz begins building a computer and invites a few reporters to cover his story. However, when the reporter arrives, his computer catches fire. Nevertheless, the reporter snaps a photo of them and publishes it in the local newspaper. On the other hand, we see a young Bill Gates, who is currently a Harvard student. He spends the majority of his time with his best friend Paul Allen while running a never-ending poker game in their dorm room. However, there's one thing more important in their lives than poker and girls, and that is their shared passion for technology. One day, the two come upon an advertisement in a trade journal, and after some quick talking by Bill and their collective intellect, Bill and Paul are hired to design a programming language for their new Altair computer. In the year 1976, Steve and Woz unveil their latest computer at the Berkeley campus. It's evident that while Wozniak's brilliance created the computer, Steve's genius is what made it successful. Woz remembers how terrible he was at social interaction back then, but Steve was brilliant. Then, in the garage of Steve's parents, Apple Computers is established, and the brains behind this enterprise are Steve, Woz, and their friends Daniel and Elizabeth. They create the first personal computer in their garage and promote their product at various events. During this time, we see Steve obsessed with his ambition to destroy their only competitor, IBM. IBM is the largest computer firm at this time, and Steve Jobs dislikes it for its lack of vision. One day, Woz informs Steve that he's signed a contract with a company called Hewlett-Packard, where he previously worked. The contract states that the corporation will get first access to anything he invents. Hearing this, Steve becomes enraged that all of their hard work and effort must now be handed to some businessman. Fortunately, the company's executives dislike the home computer because they believe regular people do not want such complicated technologies in their homes. This appears to be a victory for Steve and Woz, and they continue to conduct business on their own terms. However, computers are a relatively new invention in this era, and many people are still skeptical of their use. This raises concerns for Wozniak, who is worried that the product will not sell in the market. His fears grow as the months pass, and Steve is repeatedly turned down for a loan by banks and businessmen. Despite this, Steve remains unfazed, and eventually, venture capitalist Mike Markula approaches them and offers $250,000, allowing Apple Computers to expand and move forward. On the other hand, Bill drops out of Harvard in 1975 and comes to Albuquerque with Paul to work for a computer company called MITS. This results in a signing bonus and a royalty increase for their basic programming language, and thus Microsoft is formed. During this time in Albuquerque, Bill does everything from having a midnight race with bulldozers to racking up so many speeding tickets that he's caught and jailed. Later, at the 1977 San Francisco Computer Fair, Steve Jobs surprises his friends by changing into a professional suit and shaving his beard. Even more surprising is the fact that Apple Computers becomes a highlight of the computer fair. Bill Gates and Paul Allen also attend the event, where Apple and Microsoft meet for the first time. However, thrilled with his sudden fame, Steve Jobs entirely ignores Bill Gates. After the computer fair, Apple Computers achieves a great level of attention, revenue, growth, and prosperity that no one could have expected. However, while Woz appears to be thrilled by his newfound success, Steve begins to become increasingly arrogant. Feeling entitled to his passion, he would violate several limits, such as verbally abusing staff until they become speechless with embarrassment. One day, during an interview, Steve enters the interview room and casually rests his bare feet on the conference table. He then begins questioning the interviewee about his virginity and humiliates him by stating that he doesn't belong in the company. At this time, Steve's high school girlfriend and early Apple employee Arlene gives birth to their daughter. Despite a positive paternity test, Steve dismisses her and refuses to accept the baby as his own. Later, he pursues Arlene, urging that she does not name their daughter something strange, and they decide on Lisa. Not coincidentally, Steve eventually names a series of computers Lisa, but still doesn't acknowledge his daughter as his own publicly. On the other hand, Bill and Paul are frustrated because they're making no progress in the computer business. Therefore, they approach IBM executives and persuade them that they need what he has, which is an operating system. Furthermore, he informs them that Microsoft will only license the software to IBM, allowing Microsoft to keep ownership and license it to other companies, which was uncommon at the time. However, Microsoft doesn't currently have an operating system, and Bill is simply misleading IBM. Regardless, IBM is currently unaware of this situation and decides to purchase DOS from Microsoft. Following that, Bill and Paul immediately purchase an operating system for $50,000 from another company and modify it and rename it for their own sale. Due to this, DOS becomes one of the most important operating systems of the time, and software licenses become the dominant mode of software distribution, turning Microsoft into a key player in the IT industry. During this time, a well-known company called Xerox has currently developed the next evolution in computer technology. They've not only created software that could display pictures on a computer screen, but have also invented the mouse. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs targets these inventions created by Xerox. Both of these technologies were rejected by IBM, and Apple is looking for possibilities to use the inventions. The two new inventions are then applied to Apple's new product. Several games are now available on the computer due to the updated interface, and we can see Wozniak playing an aircraft-themed game. Incorporated in the new Apple Lisa, this earned Apple an estimated $100 billion. Over at Microsoft, Bill Gates fears Apple's expansive growth, so he heads to Apple's headquarters with his team to discuss an agreement. Steve Jobs defends Apple's supremacy, stating that Microsoft lacks originality and culture. However, Bill tries to persuade Steve that Apple is economically weak and will require Microsoft's help to keep its name in the market. Steve continues to deny him, but when Bill informs him that he will form an alliance with IBM, he agrees to the deal. At this time, Steve Jobs divides his company Apple into rival sides. The first is the old Apple computer camp, while the second is the new Macintosh development camp. He manipulates Apple employees to determine which camp is superior in order to drive internal competition. During development, he only hires the finest of the best, and he has trust issues with many people. Steve also harasses his employees by being disrespectful to them. The stress of working 90-plus hour weeks and days of sleepless programming cause many staff to rebel against his verbal abuse. The situation puts a barrier between him and Woz. Wozniak tries to convince Steve not to bully and force his employees, but Steve refuses to listen. At the same time, Steve's denial of his daughter Lisa's existence makes headlines when Arlene rightfully demands money from him. Meanwhile, Wozniak has had enough of this mess created by Steve and decides to quit the company he co-founded. Steve, on the other hand, feels more powerful and invincible and continues his work. At this point, Steve regards Bill Gates as a family member and shares his Macintosh innovations with him. Even during the press conference, he maintains that Microsoft and Apple are a family. However, Steve's good intentions are being abused by Bill, who is trying to copy Macintosh software. Microsoft leaves with Apple's Macintosh system, just as Apple left with Xerox's system. Word of this eventually reaches Steve multiple times. One day, he invites Bill to discuss this and accuses him of trying to duplicate an Apple product. Regardless of how enraged or accusing Steve becomes, Bill would always calmly explain that Microsoft is not a threat to Apple. In the next scene, Bill Gates is featured in an Apple commercial during one of the company's press conferences. His presence is highly unpleasant for Apple supporters because they know Microsoft is an Apple competitor. Furthermore, in the commercial, Bill Gates unintentionally mocks Steve Jobs by displaying his product, which leads to Steve realizing the hidden message from Bill. Later, Steve's staff bring computers from Japan full of Microsoft programs almost identical to theirs. After the conference, Steve confronts Bill Gates, accusing him of violating his trust. However, Bill reveals that they are just the same, since Apple also stole from Xerox and it has left the door open to competition. Bill is aware that all Apple did was steal from Xerox, but he admits that he first wanted to steal from Xerox, which he did. Outraged by his comments, Steve ends his business and personal ties with Bill Gates and walks away. A few years later, Steve Jobs is celebrating his 30th birthday, and he's invited all of his friends and colleagues. But since he's alienated so many of his former best friends, none of them want to toast for his birthday. 3 months after his birthday, it's revealed that Steve Jobs was fired from the company he created. Steve Wozniak now teaches computers to school children and funds ballet. The film concludes in 1997 when Jobs returns to Apple and announces an agreement between Apple and Microsoft at the Mac World Expo. It also implies that Steve Jobs is now married with children and that he's reconciled with his daughter, Lisa. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.